Right, a little bit about Surge. It seems like we are all somewhat familiar with Surge already, but this is just something we do at all of our meetings. So the purpose of Surge is to build a multiracial coalition, specifically around recruiting white people to undermine white supremacy. So it is a primarily white group for that reason, but not exclusively, and it is an inclusive and welcoming organization. There is a national umbrella organization that coordinates all the other chapters. Ohio has its own separate statewide group that will sometimes help organize statewide projects and bring in support from outside the state. And then we have our local chapter here in Cincinnati, and we mostly are connected within Hamilton County, but we have sometimes participated in things statewide as well. So Surge values are calling people in to hopefully make a space where people can learn and take the time and correct. Accountability through collective action. Making it a space where people can take risks, make mistakes, learn and make amends and keep going, because we're all going to make mistakes. Organizing out of mutual interest. Avoiding a mindset of scarcity, believing that there's enough for all, that growth is good, and that centering class is a crucial element of uniting people across races. All right, we have had some stuff going on. Oops, that is an old slide. We have had some things going on recently. Most of us who are active, other than Ray, Jane, or Carol, joined during the pandemic, and so like have never done things together except occasionally a few meetings this summer. So we had our first in-person events in September. So can one of you who was at the Honk and Wave share a little bit about that?
That we held this banner that Paula made, and we had people drive by. We were on a corner, and you can see in the distance there was a gas station that we had people drive by and stand up, show up for racial justice, and they honked their horns as they moved past us. And then we had two people running for council, and now I'm forgetting their names, but that they came by our spot and spent some time with us. We also know that down the street a little bit further, there was another group doing the same kind of things, talking about racial justice, and that the candidates moved from one station to another station. And yeah, that's what I remember.
Yep, and Karen and I and Ray Jane and Paula were there, as well as the two candidates. And the other piece of that, the Honk and Wave in context, was part of the Freedom for All rally. And it was co-sponsored by a number of Ohio social justice groups. And it was also in, it was happening on Saturday, the August 28th, which was the same day that there was a large march on Washington by the Poor People's Campaign and other groups that were really demanding equity for folks with low income and poor.
Awesome. Last Saturday, the Harriet Beecher Stowe House had a Walnut Hills walking tour that we invited people to go on, and I went to that. And unfortunately, I have a pretty awful memory, and I didn't bring anything to take notes. But I do remember several of the things. It was like a 2-hour walking tour covering a fairly small area, but in like dense detail. So all kinds of people, both people I had heard about, hadn't heard about. just different student movements, different like Black owned business districts and how they built themselves up and lifted themselves up. And just the general history of that area. So that was pretty neat. I may share more about that at some point. I guess I should probably update some people. Yeah.
I see a question in the chat asking the two candidates.
Yeah, I will have that. I'll post their names in just a minute.
Okay.
I've got it. I've got it.
Okay, yeah, just put that in the chat there.
Thank you.
So that is
Jamie Castle's one.
yeah, that's what we were able to do in person this month. And it's nice, even if we're still mostly outside, to actually be able to see each other. All right. And so, oops. Next, we are going to move on to our subject for this month, which is discussing racial autobiographies. Has anybody previously heard of this or like familiar with the concept? Because it was new to me when I think Paula mentioned it a couple months ago. She's not here today. Anyway, it comes from the Courageous Conversations curriculum, which is a pretty in-depth curriculum designed to help people have deeper conversations across divides and races and disagreements. And it's like a written exercise that really, there's a bunch of questions that it guides you through. It helps you think about maybe some things you had thought about, things you hadn't, just like where in your life were those milestones of your awareness of yourself, of your awareness of others, of your awareness of how all of that works together. And so several of us on the steering committee and those people on the call are me, Carol, Karen, and Ray Jane, have done these before. I wrote mine for this because I'd heard about it and been wanting to do it. So a couple of us are going to share a bit about our stories in racial autobiographies. So I'm going to go first and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can pull up my notes.
You want me to, we don't really have anything to share there.
I can, yes, I guess I can have you share or we can just.
I can share.
All right. New share. I am not the Zoom expert because my job never had Zoom. I work outside. Okay, let me figure out how to let Carol share your screen.
You can do that.
How do I do that?
You're doing it.
Oh, okay.
Does that work?
Yep. Now I can get out of that on mine and go over to my notes.
Okay, but I'm not on the right page. So maybe I should do that. There we go. We talked about that, guiding questions to get through. And
Yep.
You want me to tell me what page you want me on?
That's the page. I was just going to verbally tell mine and not have notes. And I, of course, didn't know what you were going to say. So, all right, I'll begin. So I am a white woman from a white family. I was not really aware of much of that until later in my life, which I will touch on. I have Irish, Scottish, German, English, and French heritage, but unfortunately, I don't really have any ties to any of that, which, as I have also learned later in life, is another kind of symptom of how whiteness has worked in America to sever some of those cultural ties. So I did grow up in Finneytown, which is a fairly racially diverse school district and neighborhood. And so I grew up, I don't remember any time where I did not know people who were of other races, but it wasn't a topic of discussion. Anytime that was referred to, it was in like a kind of colorblind, in a way that was like kind of inclusive, but not in any in-depth discussed way. And I grew up, my school did things like Black History Month with a carefully curated selection of people. We talked about Native Americans, but it was mostly, here's who lived here 5,000 years ago. I remember my parents in particular, we grew up going to really fairly white churches, but my mom liked to sing songs about Jesus loving the children all over the world. Really my only memory from childhood of being aware of race as a possibly discordant thing was I was at a birthday party for a neighbor, and somebody gave her a black Barbie doll, and I remember everybody thinking that was really weird, and it suddenly got very awkward in the room. But that was really the only experience as a kid where I was aware of it as a subject of present day tension. I became a lot more aware of this in high school, largely through the influence of one specific history teacher. He made a point in our AP US history class to talk about more in depth about specifically the way that Indigenous and Black people have been treated in America historically. We had to spend a lot of time with really uncomfortable facts and history in that class. And he also coordinated a lot of the volunteer groups at the school. So I learned from him about gentrification and over the Rhine because we were there in a shelter when it was being shut down and moved. So really that teacher, I can thank for the fact that as a high school, I learned about Emmett Till, and I learned so many adults had never even heard of him until last year. So I didn't quite connect all the dots then, but he really made a big impact on me. I also kind of started to notice then that when there were advanced and not advanced classes, that seemed to be a bit racially divided. Who knows why? But I remember noticing that and kind of like thinking like, I don't think it's because the other people are stupid. There's something going on here. My college experience was kind of different from that because most people tend to find more diversity in college and I found less. I went to Purdue University in rural Indiana and I was in the College of Agriculture. So it was a totally different switch than most people have going from high school to college. But I was also intentionally involved in a lot of groups with international students, a lot of other more mixed groups where we discussed different things. And it was actually, I remember 2 or 3 specific moments that stick out from them. One was in a like freshman leadership cohort thing where we heard different professors and administrators talk every week. And I remember that one of the deans of students, she came and talked to us about how she has spent most of her life educating students from like K through college about race. And she shared a story about how even in elementary classes, she would ask the kids to do different things like, okay, what's something that you think about Asian people? Like, what's something that you think about Native American people or Black people? And when kids are kids, they will sometimes share things that adults think but don't share. And then she would always ask, well, what about white people? And she said, there's this one time that a kid said, well, we're not anything, we're just normal. And this was a story she was sharing from a 3rd grade classroom experience. And that I'm like, oh, I'd really never thought about until then, like what whiteness is and isn't. And so that was really interesting for me. The next experience was I was in college when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And the Black student groups on campus had kind of, it wasn't like a march protest, but students wore hoodies and like signs that said, I am Trayvon. And I heard different things from certain people at home from my previous life, or not previous, or from groups I was more connected with growing up. Saying very different things, like blaming Trayvon for what happened, while other people are like, oh, well, that's maybe not the narrative as I see it. So kind of being exposed to these different options. And then in that context, a friend of mine who had an adopted Black brother introduced me to the concept of systemic racism. And I told her it didn't exist because that's illegal. She got frustrated and gave up. And she doesn't remember this conversation. I talked to her about it last year, but she's glad it made an impact on me. So all of this is kind of like lingering and brewing. Out of college, I was exposing myself to more media where I would become more aware, like through osmosis, of more of these issues. Eventually, the accumulating number of high profile deaths caused me to like actively educate myself. I think it was Philando Castile that was a tipping point for me, back to back with Alton Sterling. And then last year, when I had not a whole lot else to do during the pandemic with all the uprisings and protests, then was kind of what pushed me to the point of actually being active. So yeah, I think the one other thing that I find interesting about my journey with this is that just noticing my family doing the same journey at the same time. I have 6 siblings and 2 parents. And these are topics of conversation. When we were growing up, it wasn't discussed, but I've been able to watch my parents and siblings go through the same rethinking and enlightening and learning process, which I think most people either grew up in it or they left their parents behind. It seems to be common narratives. And I feel really lucky to have a family that is learning and growing and changing along with me. So that's my Cliff Notes version, because I didn't want to sit here and read an essay out loud. Yeah, I can go. I don't know if anybody has any questions for me specifically, and if not, we will move on to Carol.
And I just want to say hello to Denise, who's joined us.
Yes, hello.
Hello. Hi. I was in a meeting that was boring the hell out of me. And so I just happened to find you guys in this conversation and thought I'd check it out. Let's go.
All right. Just so you know, we are recording the meeting. We just want to make sure everybody knows that going in.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you.
Awesome.
They get a alert when they join the meeting.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. I can go back to sharing my screen.
I don't mind, keep going. I'd be happy to share bits and pieces of my story too. Let's see, right now I'm a 54-year-old white woman with 3 kids and a husband of almost 30 years. And I'm white. And my folks were both white. My parents both divorced and remarried, and my stepfather was Jewish ethnically, but not really religiously. And my extended family is white, excepting my aunt who'd adopted 2. She had 2 boys and she adopted 2 girls. One was Native American, one is Native American, one's Asian. And but they were both adopted as infants. And I didn't quite grow up in a colorblind household. My mom went to seminary, Union Seminary in the 60s. And she was really, didn't get a lot of stories from her. She's already passed away at this point. But I remember her talking about doing an internship for a summer and going down. It was they had an exchange program where Black divinity students came to white churches more in the north, and white divinity students went to Black churches in the south. And she talked about the minister from the North Carolina church that she was going to, driving to New York and picking her up with his family. And on the way down, she sat in the driver's in the passenger seat next to the driver, and so they could talk. And then when they got close to North Carolina, she had to move to the back seat because a white woman in the front seat with a black man might have drawn some attention from the police. So we were aware of racism, we were aware of issues, but I grew up in a white neighborhood, or it's actually an ethnically largely Jewish neighborhood that historically had been the place where Jews were allowed to live, not in the rich neighborhood, the Protestant neighborhood, but that's where I grew up. And went to a public high school that had a lot of international students, but not a whole lot of Black students. And went to college. Actually, my one racial, sort of almost racial memory, when I was about 8th grade, I remember hearing somebody say, you know, so-and-so looks Jewish. And I remember just emotionally wanting to go like this and just like, no, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. That shouldn't be said. That's not, you know, that's not nice. That's not right. Don't divide people like that. And I remember emotionally going like this, and then similarly, like just kind of peeling my fingers off my ears. It's like, you can't be a good friend to somebody if you don't understand what they're facing. And so that was sort of a beginning of my kind of awareness that I couldn't just be passive in the situation, and I couldn't just kind of wish it away. When I went to college, I needed an English class. I took an English class, even though I was an engineer, and I took a class in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And that really appealed to me because I like the idea of reading 1 or 2 books, not like dozens, and being able to go in depth. It turned out that the woman who taught the class was probably the best teacher I've ever had. And a Black woman, she was a poet and creative writing graduate student at Brown. And she, and half, probably, I don't know if it's half, but at least 1/3 of the class were students of color who were also involved in protests that were happening on campus, because Black history was marginalized, and the racist history of the money that built Brown University really hadn't been brought to the fore. And they took over the John Carter Brown Library at one point, and there were also protests going on campus about divesting from South Africa, from apartheid. And so there was a lot of dynamic discussion and kind of intercultural awareness. I really loved the English class that I was in, but I also found it challenging. I found out that I was a white woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, and that like meant something as far as an archetype, as far as a sort of the beauty thing. And also just I found myself listening to myself and questioning when I was making assumptions about people, whether I was doing that because I saw they were Black and I was assuming they were poor. I was always second guessing myself and trying to, you know, see if I was kind of taking that narrative that's in the culture at large and applying it to specific people without cause and without I kind of got tired of it. I kind of felt like if I'm going to have a conversation with somebody and I want to be my whole authentic self, how can I do that if I'm having a sidebar conversation in my head about whether I'm being racist or not? And I had an opportunity. Brown has an exchange program with Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi, which is, you know, white and Black, but also Brown is bigger, Tougaloo's smaller. Brown's, of course, a lot wealthier. Tougaloo's a lot less, it's a lot smaller and less financially resourced. But I went to Tougaloo for a semester, And I figured if everybody around me was Black, I was going to kind of have to get over myself because I was really just not excited about it. And it was a great experience. And again, I don't think we talked about race. It was clear that race was in the context. And I remember being a little bit afraid of white people in Mississippi because were they going to treat me differently because I was around Black people all the time? Or was I going to, was I going to kind of be a threat? But I never had any issues like that come up. And I think there were probably some dynamics that race and assumptions and prejudices and so forth played into it. But, by and large, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And it was a real eye opener for me about the white culture that I was in at Brown, where everybody was so busy. And if things got emotionally uptight, you could just say you were busy and that was important. And you didn't have to really deal with any emotional challenges because you were busy and that was important. And at Tougaloo, it was a small school. There were like 500 students on campus, maybe. And sometimes things came up and sometimes you could resolve them and sometimes you couldn't. And that was a reality check for me. So it was a good thing. I ended up doing a bachelor's degree in English literature and mechanical engineering with the English literature focused in African American literature because I just realized how little I had been taught growing up and how much I loved the honesty and the challenge that Black writers dug into and the strength. And I ended up still being an engineer, but I was always kind of listening and learning. And when I became a professor for a little while, I was just really dramatically aware of how few Black students were at my school at OU. And though actually statistically speaking, we did well because we actually did have a significant recruiting program. But it still was like 12% or 8%, and that was like high for the relative rural location we had, but it was better than Miami. And I just kept wanting things to be better. And I guess one of the big things that sort of changed the narrative for me was Hurricane Katrina and watching our country completely fail African American residents of New Orleans. And say horrible lies about them. And just, and the couple of things that I could do about that were try and teach my students in a way that would help them understand that they held people's lives in their hands, because I was teaching engineers, and some engineers designed the levees that broke and said that, yeah, 3's, better than a 2, but yeah, maybe not quite as strong as a 4, but that doesn't happen very often. I couldn't, and I wanted students who maybe weren't the most academically gifted to be able to understand what decisions were being made and to not think that their positions didn't matter. But as more things happened, Trayvon Martin and so forth and so on. And I read an article somewhere that talked about the racism of the message that, if Black people just get better educated, everything would be better. And how that was really assuming that Black people had done something wrong and that white people were, just neutral, which they weren't. And I got a lot more involved in when I moved to Cincinnati and connected with a lot of different folks who are doing voter registration, voter organizing, education, and most of the folks that I was working with were Black, and I just really appreciated that. That was one of the best things about leaving Athens was not entirely white, but very, very white, and I think I do remember like maybe 15 years ago listening to NPR and wondering when people of color's voices would be heard on the radio, because it's like NPR, it's like supposed to be America, and everybody sounded like they were from that generic part of the country. And just in the last 4 or 5 years, I finally started hearing that. And just in the last 4 or 5 years, people have started to talk about race and racism and our embedded biases and our cultural blind spot. Sounds like such a neutral word, and it really is nothing close to it. So, and I guess the biggest race issue that came up for me was about 3 years ago. A member of our church was a person of color and had been really proactive in bringing in Black people and doing these really wonderful, diverse sermons and ceremonies at our church. Really tried to push back against our minister's approach to leadership. And it was perceived as the minister being attacked, and he so deeply overreacted. And I watched the whole thing happen and was just like, wow. And it hurt, and it really hurt, because I didn't quite realize how white people who seem to care and not necessarily toe the line in a lot of different ways really could get a sense of being threatened by a person of color. My friend's skin was very dark, but he wasn't Black American. And that, I've described it as having the rose-colored glasses taken off and you seeing color, but it's like a repeated cycle. It's not something you like grow out of. It's something that just every now and then you get a little complacent, and every 4 or 5 years it's like, oh shit, it's not even close to that neutral. So that's my kind of where I'm at, and I'm still trying to do some work here from my basement. Getting to know some good people. Thanks, guys. Happy to answer any questions or thoughts.
So, I had Claire joined us. I didn't notice that. The incident at your church, wasn't that also part of a catalyst for getting involved with Surge and starting the chapter?
It was. That was, seeing these white people who I thought were progressive and caring and knowledgeable, and seeing them just not even realize how overblown their reactions were and how damaging their kind of assumptions and self-defensiveness was, or white fragility, you might call it. I didn't have that vocabulary at the time. Yeah, I wanted to bring white people into this conversation and help white people stop doing so much damage and really be able to understand how some of those triggers that they're feeling, that discomfort, that that sense of unease, is something that they need to deal with it. And they need to understand that Black person or person of color in front of them who's challenging them is long overdue. and how they respond to that is going to make a huge difference in how we move forward, and how much power white people have in so many settings, especially of a certain age and management or whatever world you live in, whether it's education or healthcare or politics or business. White people who see and listen and understand and recognize patterns of race and racism and can have challenging conversations, can point out that somebody's voice has not been heard, or can help bring another voice to the table, can have a huge impact in the long run, and those are missing. And so Surge felt like a way to really try and get some more knowledge about, okay, how do we get white people involved here? Because I love working with Black people, and but I don't think they need me. I think white people need to have a little more chances to talk about race. I just had a conversation last month with the gentleman, and I mean, he started talking and talking about it, and you know, once he realized that I was somebody who had actually done a little of this work, and so, I mean, he just, you could tell that this was somebody who really had a lot of passion for a lot of these issues, and who didn't get to talk about it with most of the white people or anybody really probably that he worked with, and that so I really want to not just let people vent, but I want people to be empowered to kind of push back and find ways to really help change the balance, level
So
the
I
playing.
see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, Denise.
Oh, hey, yeah, you know, as a person of color, I mean, I'm listening to you and I so appreciate what you're saying, because it's tough dealing with the structural racism of the church and how the church has been founded and all of the traditions and all of the things that have been established, and yet trying to maneuver your way to still have a relationship with God. it's it's a very tough divide, and that's a really hard conversation because white people don't respond to that very well. If you don't know the history, and unfortunately a lot of people don't know the history of how the church was structured. And so, I mean, I feel for you in that sense, but at the same time, I guess my question is, how are you managing now in trying to separate yourself from that situation and still hopefully, or, you know, maybe not, maintain a relationship in your faith with God?
Thank you for the question. It's still painful, and I don't have a real answer to it. So I'm a Unitarian Universalist. So my relationship with God is something that I feel pretty spiritual about, but I don't have like a book that I think is the source of the word. And the way I've done it is I've found wonderful people who really have worked hard on their racial issues and are Unitarians, but they're kind of like maybe 5% from this church and 2% from this church, and a lot of them are part of what's called the UU Council, and I'm on the UU Council, and I've actually been elected by the UU Council to represent Unitarians on the MARC board, which is the Metropolitan Area Religious Coalition of Cincinnati, MARCC. And so, and Karen, I met Karen before I joined MARC. When I found out Karen was on MARC, I was thrilled. And so there are people, like I said, and actually several of the folks in this group are UUs, a couple of them anyway. And it's just a tension and a piece of what I hope someday will be less so, you know. But I live in Southeast Ohio, Southwest Ohio. So I don't know that things are, I think things are a little better. And actually, I think the passive color blindness is probably still extremely common on the East Coast. I think the virulent racism that I have seen around the edges here, not so much, and then on the East Coast, but at least not where I grew up. So I think there's a lot of bullies out there, and there's a lot of folks who are scared and they don't really understand their own trauma, and they don't understand their reactivity, and they don't understand how much pain and damage they do. And I kind of want to help them learn that and see that. And, you know, we gotta work at it. We gotta find, especially white people who've lived in that little bubble of cotton and clouds. So hopefully it doesn't have to be, you know, more trauma, because I don't think that's really, actually, maybe at the end, Marie, I'd love to talk about this book that I'm reading right now or listening to. And it's talking about how mindfulness is a big part of people's being able to lower the temperature and open their heads and hearts to something that may not be what they grew up with and may kind of contradict what they believe.
Huh.
Thanks for
Yeah.
asking.
Thank you.
Would love to hear about that, Dan. I also left a little time. I know, like, because I like if you do the like full racial autobiography
I
thing,
talked
that
too
can.
long.
Oh, what was that?
You talked too long.
Yeah, that can take to like write it out and work through it can take hours, but I just wanted to leave
Here's-
space in case anybody just hearing those stories and thinking about anything in your own life, if you had any moments, any memories, anything you wanted to share of your own experience of race over your life. If you wanted to share that, I just wanted to leave some spots open, and there's some questions to prompt that if you would like. Yeah, does anybody have anything else they would like to share about their own experiences? And it's okay if nobody does. These are,
I'll give them a minute. It's
Yeah.
not an easy question.
yeah, these are significant questions. And
Are
you
there any
have to read them first.
Are there any moments in your early life that stick out to you as moments of racial awareness? How has your understanding of race, of your own race, changed over time? What have been some moments or stories that galvanized you to learn about Surge showing up for racial justice? Any other personal comments or stories you'd like to share? But again, we're kind of looking for tidbits rather than the full
Yeah.
narrative.
And I will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who is here, and it will include a link to that full exercise in case anybody else wants to go through that process and think about it as well. All right. Thank you for being here, Karen. Or when you have to jump off.
I would probably also recommend, I'm with Lincoln Memorial Church, and we have a book study on racism in America, and we are just finishing with The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. And
What's
so
the name of the church?
I'm with Lincoln Memorial, Pastor George Nicholas. And we're just finishing up with The Color of Compromise for anybody that might be interested. It's an excellent reading material for people that aren't aware of the things that we were talking about. It gives you a lot of good insight in how the church was formed, how it started in America, and how it's progressed since then. So, just adding that as a tidbit if somebody's interested.
Awesome.
Where is Lincoln Memorial Church?
It's on 641 Maston. It's right off of Main Street, where the U-Haul place is, right across the street from there.
Awesome. And is this like is it like a Zoom book club, or is it?
They're doing it on Zoom. Yeah, I mean, we
Okay.
have gone in and we've met in person, but he has had it on Zoom. As a matter of fact, if you go back and you pull up Lincoln, you should be able to pull up information about that. As I said, we're right at the end of it right now. But if people are interested in trying to gain that kind of information, it's an excellent resource.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I will definitely look that up. I love a book club.
Especially one where they don't try and do one book per meeting. Where you,
Oh man, yeah. I'm in a couple really casual ones where it's a book a month, and I'm like, you know what? I maybe do 4 of the books a year. Carol,
book.
did you want to share anything else about the book you were talking about?
Sure. Actually, 2 books I'll share. One is a book by another book by Ijeoma.
Oh yeah, Ijoma
Olu.
Yeah.
And she wrote a book called So You Want to Talk about race. And she's compassionate, but she doesn't pull punches. she's very, and there's like a chapter, like I think it's chapter 13, right toward the end, which we really should like do a heavy study on, because that's the real call to action chapter. A lot of it is, I mean, I've been working kind of on this race issue for 20, 30 years. And the stuff that even the things that I read in that book kind of just like,
Mm.
I hadn't seen all of that, so really good. But the one that I was talking about with the mindfulness here is by Rhonda McGee. And this is actually a video where she's talking. It's a TED Talk, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, and TEDx, I guess it is. And she is a law professor, Black woman law professor, who was teaching law and eventually started teaching about race, and on the side in her own private life to deal with some of the things that she'd been dealing with when she was a lawyer before she became a professor, and as she was a professor, she had started meditating to just try and work through a lot of the things that came up for her. And when she was teaching about race, she finally realized that people couldn't hear sometimes what she was saying because they were so triggered, so tense, so closed-minded to it. And so she ended up she took a lot of courage. Law school, any professorial kind of situation took a lot of courage, but she brought mindfulness into the law classroom and really kind of tried to bring people into their best whole selves so that they could hear stories from other people and share stories from themselves that, were hard. And just, it was really transformative experience for her and for many, many, many of her students. And it's really a really nice book. I haven't gotten very far into it, but it's pretty different.
Awesome. I have opened that tab.
And Denise, did you just raise your hand again? Or is that the same one? Okay.
All right. So if nobody else has any specific anecdotes you want to share, which again is totally fine.
Do we want to just I feel like I've heard my voice way too much. Ray Jane, Dora, Jeremy, Claire. Hi, Claire. You're on camera. That's nice. Anybody else wanted to share just even just a tidbit, something that why are you here? Can we do that? Why does race matter to you?
Or what brings you to a surge meeting? And I know Dora, you shared some about this earlier yourself.
I don't think Denise heard it, but I wouldn't mind hearing it again. I think I was sort of in prep mode.
I honestly don't remember what I said earlier. But I mean, there's a lot of reasons that I'm here. I think like one thing that I've been thinking about, it's not completely on topic for racial autobiography, but it relates. I would say I've done a lot of work. I've worked in the field of education, and I've done a lot of work over the years with lots of different ethnic and racial groups. But primarily I've worked at programs that mostly work with students of color and that mostly work with low-income families. And so I've done a lot of thinking about this over the years. There's a lot more for me to learn, and as there is for everyone, I think. But I think one of the things I've been thinking more and more about is like, have I gotten it all backwards? Should I have been doing work with white folks this whole time? Because I feel like that's really like, like where the problem is. Like, this is like, I think I'm not like saying it that eloquently, but I think you get the idea. It's like I think there's just so much more. There's a lot more that can be done, I think, to educate ourselves, educate other white folks, and do better. And it has me kind of questioning, like, you know, my career and what I want to do next. And so anyway, that's just like a little bit of where I'm at right now. But thank you for sharing, both of you, tonight too. It was really interesting to hear. I appreciate it.
Thanks for being here.
All right. Claire, if you're talking, I can see your mouth moving, but I can't hear you.
I wasn't moving my mouth, but I was thinking about what I might want to say.
Oh, okay. I
I'm
think it was
sorry
just-
that I missed your story, Maria. I'll have to catch up with you later. I got in on this right as Carol was starting hers. I've I've been involved in work issues tonight later than usual, so I was only able to hook in a little bit after 8 o'clock. But I value what these autobiographical sketches bring up, and those questions that you posed are excellent. It's given me a lot to think about as I reflect on it. I think I'm in a lifelong journey. I feel very fortunate that my father, though I grew up in a very racist neighborhood of rural northern Indiana, farm country, I feel grateful that my father, through various experiences, exposed us children to a variety of races and cultures early on. Very unusual in a way, because he was on the board of directors of a mission, a homeless center in Chicago, and would drag us kids. I was the oldest kid, but there were 4 boys. We were pretty close in age, and he would take us all up with him to Chicago. I remember 5, 6 years old interacting with Black kids and all kinds of kids in a homeless shelter for women and children. We had a family from India live in our basement apartment for about 6 months. They dressed with Indian clothes. They cooked Indian food. You know, I had neighbors that had no clue about these other things, but here I was. My father was a welder, a farm machinery repair guy. He had his business beside our house, and he would work with migrant workers. That he knew Spanish because he had spent 3 years in Puerto Rico before he started his own business and maintenance work. And so the migrants would bring their stuff to repair, and I'd have interaction with these kids in a sandbox, you know, behind our house. They'd come along with their parents. So I felt very fortunate in that regard. But what's really striking is that even though I had this awareness that white was not the best and not the only race, I discovered in recent years that I still had roots of racism in me and prejudice that I was not totally aware of. Some of that was revealed by reading a book called Trouble I've Seen by a friend of mine named Drew Hart. And that was a real eye-opening experience. So that was a very formative book for me. And I only read that a couple of years ago. So I think no matter where we've grown up, there is still something about being human that causes us to think that our culture is the best, our race is the best, that we have to fight against somehow, and really get humble. And the only way to work at that is to build relationships with as broad a diversity of people as we can possibly do that. And when I think about my relationships with who I'm closest to, almost all of them really are white, in spite of what I know in my head. I still gravitate toward those of my own race. So that is why I'm in Surge, is to keep working at this lifelong journey of deeper connection and rooting out my own racism.
All right. I think we
Thanks,
can
Claire.
move on to that last slide. It seems
there.
like
I just put the link to the Surge Cincinnati Facebook group if you're not already in that, but I think, Jeremy, you're in there, aren't you?
or maybe it's
I think
the
so.
page. I know that's usually where you see the events posted.
I try and post them to the group, but they don't always get there in time. All right.
Okay, so our October is not jam-packed with meeting in person, unlike our September. There is a series on a docu-series on race and racism in Cincinnati, part 1. I missed it this past week. I know Claire and Ray Jane saw it and said it was great. It's on Thursdays and Saturdays, but Thursdays are full for both the October and November slots. And so Claire, they said people can still learn and show up even if they miss part 1, correct?
Yes, they said that Saturday. I was in the
Okay.
Saturday group. It was excellent. Highly, highly recommend it. And I don't think it's a problem if you missed, I mean, you missed a big chunk of history, important history, if you missed the first session, but you can pick up on, it's going to pick up from the Civil War going forward in part 2. And it picks, what it does is goes from early history with Native American history in Cincinnati all the way up to Civil War in part 1.
Awesome.
We just have a new person joining us. This is
Oh.
David Whaley, who's a friend of mine from Athens, Ohio, some 10 years back, and is
Oh.
actually another UU. Hey, David.
All right. I also, as a last thing, just wanted to share a few
David, I
updates
know.
on what's been going on behind the scenes. So back in July, the steering committee first connected with a coach from Surge National, and she's been great helping us like orient ourselves as a team, get to know each other better, get to understand what our chapter could be. And we'll soon be getting to a point where our behind the scenes restructuring is to a point where we can start actually engaging people more and turning people out into other projects, whether it's with us or with partners. So yeah, probably their next part of that is going to be in the next few weeks to a month, reaching out individually to some of the people who have repeatedly shown up, such as you, Jeremy, just to get input on what you would like to see our chapter doing, what you like to do, what your connections are. So I, for one, am excited. Like, I love our discussions on interesting topics every month, but I'm also excited, like, what can we do that'll get more people engaged, that'll get more people excited, that'll help us recruit more people to help partners and get things done. So I don't know if anybody else on the steering committee had anything to add to that or expand on. But yeah, that's kind of, I'm excited. It's been fun so far. And that's all I've got for the meeting.
Huh, okay. I guess as far as upcoming things go, I guess I wanted to briefly touch on couple things that are coming up that are tangentially related.
Mhm.
So this weekend is going to be October 2nd, and I guess a lot of people probably noticed this already. There's going to be a lot of marches for reproductive freedom this weekend, especially on October 2nd. Uh, and not directly a race issue, but as with so many things like this, it does become a class issue, and then it becomes a race issue
Mhm.
in a lot of cases. Currently, as far as I know, there is an event there's one in Dayton and one in Cincinnati. Uh, I can put links to both of them in the chat.
That would be lovely.
Make sure those work. If Zoom would cooperate with me.
Why would it do that? Bye, Carol.
Bye, guys, and nice seeing you, David.
And from the looks of it, ironically, it looks like the Dayton event is the one that's getting the most traction right now. Again, it's with these being so close together, that's not too uncommon. I feel like sometimes whichever one comes first is going to pull traction from the other one if they're that close enough that people from one location are going to flow to the other one. So that's coming up this weekend.
To know.
As I guess let's see, what else might I have? So I guess the other thing I have is probably not immediately relevant to this group right now, but I guess a contact info you might want to have in your back pocket. I'm with a local group known as a Coalition for Community Safety, and one of the main things we do in addition, there's a couple of things that we mostly do. One is mutual aid. We do things like free lunches, needle exchange, things like that. The other thing we do is we provide first aid support for direct action and community actions. If you've been out for certain events over the past, like in 2020 or something, you've probably seen some of us out there. And I'd also like to put out some contact info for that.
Yes, I am taking notes. Actually, yeah, if you drop it in the chat, I will be saving the chat. Yeah, I'd heard about these kinds of things popping up in other cities, and I have been wondering if there was any formal kind of group in Cincinnati. So this is fantastic.
So yeah, if there's like if there is a direct action or community action of significant size that you feel might need this kind of support, that's an email you can reach us at for that purpose. And we also know some of the other other local organizations or groups that provide other things like marshals, things like that. So probably not immediately relevant, but something to keep in the back pocket.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what I got for now.
Thank you for sharing that. I know we've also had some discussion, really a thing that Claire's been following a lot, with the way that the school board race has gotten kind of wild in Forest Hills, especially centering on candidates' views on critical race theory. So yeah, that's been kind of wild to watch that. Your updates on that.
It's very wild. We've got people polarized with who they want to pick to be on the school board. They're trying to pick 4 people out of 7 candidates, and you see signs all over Anderson Township with 4 people on this sign, and then another sign is 4 people who are totally opposite in worldview and culture, and it's just a ideological war going on, and it all boils down to basically racism.
Yeah, well, stay tuned in your emails and on Facebook for more updates from us, especially as we get ready to transition what we can do as a chapter. And thank you, everybody who came today and shared the discussion. It's nice to have people consistently showing up. So
Thank you, Maria, for putting this together.
You're welcome. I'm going to download the chat as I usually forget because I want these links. Okay, chat is saved. All right, I'm going to stop the recording and I will see you all later.
Bye, everyone.